Alright, good afternoon. Long time no video, mostly because A, I'm a boring adult with a full-time job, and B, this house has absolutely no natural light during winter. Even right now I have a very bright lamp in the corner of my room. So today we're going to be talking about Aífe. This is a story about Cú Chulainn because I love Cú Chulainn. He is my disaster son. This is very much not a story that portrays him in a positive light. And I think it would be safe to say he's firmly down the disaster end of the spectrum in this one. So the name of the story translates as The Violent Death of Aífe's Only Son, so as you can probably imagine, it doesn't exactly end well. It's an old Irish text, or at least the version I'm telling is. There's an early modern version too, called The Violent Death of Conla, which has a few interesting features. It also crops up briefly in Keating's History of Ireland, and there's a very brief reference to it in the Metricotin Cheneches as well, but I'm just focusing on the old Irish version found in one of our favourite manuscripts, the Yellow Book of Lecan. My mum thinks the Yellow Book of Lecan sounds like the Little Book of Calm, as seen in Black Books, and now every time it comes up when I'm researching, I think about that. So, now you will too! You're welcome! So the story's been dated to about the 9th century. I'm basing this on translations by Kuno Meyer and Geoffrey Gantz. The Gantz version is in early Irish myths and sagas, which if you hadn't guessed from these videos so far is quite a good source for the texts we generally refer to as the Ulster cycle. Has quite a lot of them in there. And given that this story is about Cú Chulainn, it's safe to assume it's part of what we generally call the Ulster cycle. It's often listed as a revscéil or foretale to the time, a prequel, if you like. Chronologically, it doesn't really fit, and the events of it are never referenced in Time Bacúilne itself, because, you know, that would suggest internal consistency, and as I may have mentioned, cycles are fake. Anywho, this story starts in roughly the same period as Tochfach Ever, which is the story in which Cú Chulainn woos his wife. That is to say, he's currently in training with the warrior woman Scothach, and during that period he ends up sleeping with another female warrior, Aífe. How exactly that went down, it varies from text to text. We're not going to get bogged down in that, and Aífe's exact identity also seems to change, but what this story tells us is that A, Aífe is Scothach's sister, and B, Cú Chulainn got her pregnant. That's kind of all we need to know right now. Cú Chulainn is not exactly the type to, like, stick around for the child to be born, and he heads back to Ireland fairly shortly after that. Before he leaves, he gives her a gold thumb ring for the child, saying that when the boy is old enough to wear it, i.e. when he comes of age, he should be sent to Ireland to find Cú Chulainn. But he places 3 prohibitions, or gessi, on the kid. He's not allowed to turn back on any road he sets out on, he's not allowed to refuse any fight, and he's not allowed to tell anyone his name. 7 years later, Conla, that's the boy's name, travels to Ireland. When he arrived, he lands on a beach named Trachdeshi, and he's practicing his feats of arms, all the tricks of weapons that warriors learn when they train with Scothach and use henceforth to prove how badass they are. The Ullad are watching him, more than a little taken aback to find a tiny child performing such impressive feats. Damn, says Concavach, the king of Ulster. If little kids can do that where he's from, I really don't want to meet their grown warriors. They will crush us into tiny little pieces. They decide that somebody needs to go and talk to the kid, ideally before he goes on a murderous rampage. So they send Condora, son of Echu. Who is this guy? I have no idea. As far as I recall, he doesn't come up in any other texts, but I might be wrong about that. Anyway, he's supposedly a good choice to encounter heavily armed 7-year-olds. So he goes down to the beach to talk to Conla. He asks the boy for his name and lineage, which predictably Conla refuses to tell him. He suggests Conla might like to divert his path so that he doesn't, you know, invade Ulster, and predictably Conla refuses to do that as well. Politely, Condora then greets him, praises his skill at arms, and invites him to come and meet with the Ullad in friendship, naming some of their great heroes as people who would love to meet him. Conla listens to all of this and then says, "So do you guys want to fight me like one at a time or all at once?" Then he tells Condora to go and fetch somebody else, since he is clearly not worthy of a fight. Ouch. Coming from a 7-year-old, that has got a sting. So Condora goes back to the Ullad and tells them what went down, and now it's Conall Cernach's turn to go and speak to Conla. Conall is one of the big heroes of the Ulster cycle, which is why it's kind of funny that things just go so terribly for him in this particular story, because Conla just yeets a rock at him from his slingshot so fast it breaks the freaking sound barrier, knocking him head over heels, and then disarms him while he's just lying there, stunned. So embarrassed, Conall goes back to the Ullr, at which point Cú Chulainn rocks up and starts heading down to the beach to talk to Conall. And by talk to, I mean fight, because it's Cú Chulainn, it's not a real conversation unless there's violence as far as he's concerned. His wife, Eva, tries to stop him. Somehow, she knows the identity of the boy, identifying him clearly as Conall, the only son of Aífe. She points out that it would be extremely dishonourable to just straight up murder his own son, a warning that Cú Chulainn completely ignores. And not only does he not listen to her, he tells her to shut up and stop interfering because the advice of women is useless at times like this. No heroic deed was ever performed with the help of a woman, so why should he listen to her? Wow. You know how I said this story really doesn't show Cú Chulainn at his best? The misogyny is real. Apparently, murdering children is the manly thing to do, and women just don't understand. So Cú Chulainn reaches the beach and asks Conall for his name, and the boy refuses to tell him, even though Cú Chulainn makes it pretty clear that he'll die if he doesn't. You would think, even leaving aside Eva's very clear and explicit warning, that Cú Chulainn would at this point recall the prohibitions he placed on his son, and might possibly pause for thought, but Cú Chulainn has one brain cell and it's firmly in the keeping of his charioteer Lech, who is not in this story, which is probably why everything goes so terribly wrong. Or at least that's how I read it anyway. So inevitably they fight and Cú Chulainn is getting thrashed by this 7-year-old. Like, they're wrestling in the water and the child just keeps ducking him. I mean, if you follow the timeline from the time that says that he was 6 when he trained with Scartha, meaning that 7 years have passed since then, he's only going to be like 13, 14 at most. But it is deeply disturbing to think about him fathering Conall at 6, and Tochmach Eva doesn't seem to follow exactly the same timeline, and that's the one that this matches up more closely with, although none of them match up chronologically. So anyway, we're just not going to think about how old Cú Chulainn is, but he may only be like 13. It's still embarrassing that he's getting thrashed by a 7-year-old. Let's be real. Anyway, they're fighting it out, and it looks like for once in his life Cú Chulainn might actually use, which would be embarrassing, so he does what he always does in these situations. He uses the Gay Bolga. The Gay Bolga, if you don't remember from the last time it came up in a video, is a truly horrifying weapon. It is basically an expanding barbed spear that rips people apart from the inside. Charming. Crucially, it's a weapon that Scartha only ever taught to Cú Chulainn, despite the fact she must have known that it was going to end up like this. So he's more or less invincible when he uses it. Now, normally it involves his charioteer having to throw it to him downstream, but in this story he seems to be able to use it all by himself, which means he doesn't need to involve anyone else, as he fatally and brutally wounds his 7-year-old son. All the glory is his. He lifts Conall's ravaged body and carries him onto the shore where the Ullr are waiting. "This is my son," he says. So clearly he knew all along, because it's not like Conall had a chance to introduce himself, and Conall asks now to have a chance to meet the great men of Ulster just once before he dies, remarking wistfully that if he'd lived, he'd have gone with them on great adventures and been the greatest of them all. He puts his arms around each of their necks in turns before bidding farewell to his dad and dying in his arms. At that point, everybody is understandably totally bummed by everything that went down, so they mourn Conall, bury him, raise a grave marker, which is later referenced in the Dincheanchas, or lore of place names, as the origin of a name. And everyone is like, oh yeah, this is super tragic. And nobody goes, should we maybe just like throw Cú Chulainn in the sea for kinslaying? Apparently that just doesn't come up. And that's the end of Cú Chulainn's experiments in fatherhood. I think we can safely say that it does not suit him. Now, this early version of the story puts all the blame squarely on Cú Chulainn. He places the prohibition on Conall. He ignores Eva's warning. He is the one who kills Conall. Later versions it becomes a little bit more ambiguous, especially because in one version it's Aífe who puts the prohibitions on Conall, and meanwhile the Dincheanchas says that it's both of their faults, Aífe for sending him to Ireland and Cú Chulainn for killing him. Regardless of the exact apportion of blame, I think it's pretty clear that they're both terrible parents and should not be allowed near children. So I guess it's lucky that as far as we know, they never met again after that. Good times. Anyway, this has been today's episode of Medieval Irish Literature is full of seriously jacked 7-year-olds, so please tune in next time for whatever story I decide to tackle next. It may involve St. Patrick's, since 'tis getting to be the season. If you've enjoyed this video and want to support my ongoing research and future MA, please consider dropping a couple of quid in my tip jar linked below. There are also links to various resources and places you can read the story in the original, and just so you can check I'm not making stuff up. And you'll find all of my social media links down there too. If there are any other stories you would particularly like me to tackle, please drop them in the comments. See you soon!